You were never meant to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried for over 2 centuries, sealed away in archives, erased from the record, whispered only in corridors where secrets rot but never die. Imagine workers in 1811 tearing down an old tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia. Their hammers strike wood, splinters scatter, dust fills the air, until suddenly silence. Beneath the floorboards, they uncover not rats, not mold, but 8 identical boxes. Inside each box a man's wedding ring, etched with a name and date. And beside each ring a vial, tiny glass filled with powder that smelled faintly of almonds and decay. 8 rings, 8 men, 8 husbands, all bound to one woman, Ruth Holloway, a widow the city once adored, admired for her beauty, her refinement, her supposed knowledge of healing herbs. A woman who was welcomed into Virginia's highest circles, who played the role of grieving wife with theatrical perfection. But beneath the lace collars and the polite conversation, something venomous was at work. For 30 years, she moved like a shadow through Richmond society, and behind her smile, 8 men fell. The authorities who stumbled upon that macabre collection were horrified. They understood what it meant, yet they also understood something far more dangerous. The men she had killed were not random. They were powerful, connected. Their families were the foundation of Virginia's wealth and influence. To expose the truth would shatter not just reputations, but the fragile order of a society built on secrecy and betrayal. So the magistrates buried the case. They sealed the evidence. They locked Ruth Holloway's name inside silence. But secrets are like poison. They seep, they wait, they stain everything they touch. And tonight, I will unseal what was never meant to be unsealed. I will guide you into the labyrinth Ruth carved, one husband at a time, until you see not just the face of one woman's deadly obsession, but the larger design. Because Ruth Holloway's murders were not about money, not about grief, not even about lust for power. They were about something older, something deeper, a network of betrayal hidden in plain sight. So hear me now. This is not just the tale of a widow. It is the anatomy of psychological control, a forbidden truth about how societies protect corruption, silence dissent, and let monsters dine at their tables. Ruth Holloway did not arrive in Richmond as a monster. She arrived as a vision, an angel draped in mourning black, her voice soft, her story tragic. It was the autumn of 1782, a time when Virginia was still licking its wounds from revolution. The scars of war were everywhere, plantations burned, fortunes broken, widows scattered like ashes across the state. And into that atmosphere of grief and shifting power, Ruth stepped forward with a tale that melted hearts. She claimed she was the widow of Captain Jonathan Holloway, a patriot who had perished at Yorktown. His sacrifice had left her destitute, she said, but she carried with her the refinement of New England, a cultured accent, and a mind sharpened by education. The people of Richmond welcomed her with open arms. They saw not a predator, but salvation. For she had something no other woman of her station possessed: knowledge of medicine. She could name herbs in Latin, brew tonics for fevers, soothe the nervous ailments with tinctures drawn from roots and leaves. In an age when medicine was closer to superstition than science, her remedies worked just well enough to convince. She carried a leather-bound journal. She claimed it was filled with her family's healing traditions. In truth, its pages contained something else: formulas of power, designed to heal in one hand and to kill in the other. The elite adored her. Dinner tables whispered of her intelligence. Men marveled at her composure. Women admired her grace. Widowed, beautiful, intelligent, she was the perfect ornament for Virginia's rising society. And in a land where death had stolen so many wives, she was desirable prey and yet also the hunter. But Ruth did not choose her husbands at random. No, she had a pattern, a quiet arithmetic only she understood. She was not collecting rings, she was harvesting secrets. For the men she targeted shared something hidden, a link to treason during the war. Men who had switched allegiances for British gold. Men who had betrayed their fellow countrymen and profited from it. They believed their sins were buried. Ruth had come to remind them that nothing stays buried forever. And so she wove her charm around them like silk, binding them with her tragic beauty and her supposed devotion. They saw a widow needing protection. They never saw the noose tightening. The slaves whispered first. They noticed what others ignored. Strange illnesses that struck only after Ruth's marriage, always beginning in the stomach, always ending in death. They spoke in hushed tones about teas that smelled bitter, about remedies that tasted faintly of almonds. But in a world where their voices were dismissed, no one listened, no one except Ruth, and she knew silence was her strongest weapon. The summer of 1783 hung heavy over Richmond, the air thick with heat, tobacco smoke, and the illusions of prosperity. In the grand home of Colonel Edmund Fairfax, one of the city's wealthiest tobacco merchants, a new bride tended to her husband with angelic devotion. Fairfax was no frail man. He was robust, hearty, known for his strength and appetite for life. Yet within 6 months of marrying Ruth Holloway, he was brought to his knees by an illness that came out of nowhere, devouring him from within. It began as stomach pain, a discomfort easily dismissed. But it grew sharp pangs, waves of nausea, weakness so sudden it seemed unnatural. Servants whispered in the shadows of the house, but their words went unheard by those who mattered. One man, Jupiter, the house servant closest to Fairfax, claimed he saw something others ignored. He told the slaves of other households what he had witnessed that humid August night. He had heard moans from the study past midnight. When he crept to the window, he saw the colonel hunched over his desk, his face drenched in sweat, his hands clutching his stomach. And beside him stood Ruth, calm, almost serene, offering him a steaming cup of her special remedy. "Drink this, my dear Edmund," she cooed, her voice a velvet knife. "It will ease the pain. I prepared it with care." He drank, and within minutes his body betrayed him. Convulsions, gasps, the sound of flesh slamming against wood as he collapsed forward onto his desk. Paper scattered, ink, blood into the floorboards. Ruth stood perfectly still. No panic, no horror, only watchfulness, as if studying her own experiment unfold. Then, only after silence filled the room, did she cry out. Only then did she summon the house into chaos. Dr. Harrison arrived at dawn. He found Ruth weeping over her husband's body, her grief a performance so convincing it bent reality. She told him the colonel had been troubled, his stomach weakened by stress and spoiled food. The doctor examined the body, found nothing unusual, and concluded death by gastric fever, a diagnosis so common in Virginia that no one questioned it. But Jupiter knew. He had seen the cup, the way she rinsed it immediately, prepared for this outcome. He had heard the insistence in her voice, the demand that he drink. Yet Jupiter's word held no weight, his truth locked inside a world where the enslaved were silenced by law and fear. Colonel Fairfax's funeral was lavish. The widow, draped in black lace, fainted at the graveside, collapsing into the arms of sympathetic friends. Richmond society praised her devotion, her tragedy, her fortitude in the face of loss. But Ruth's grief had teeth. Her tears bought her inheritance, land, gold, and the Fairfax estate. She emerged from the funeral richer, more admired, more powerful. Wealth never lingers long without suitors circling. Barely 3 months after Colonel Fairfax was laid in the earth, Ruth Holloway was seen again in Richmond society, her veil still black, her grief still fresh, or so it seemed. But the mask of mourning did not shield her from attention, it magnified it. Men saw not tragedy but opportunity. Here was a widow refined, intelligent, wealthy, and alone. Among them was Captain William Randolph, a shipping magnate who had built his fortune supplying the Continental Army during the war. He was a man of the sea, hardened by storms, respected for his endurance and feared by his rivals. Yet even a man who could master the Atlantic could not master the widow's gaze. Within weeks, whispers swirled of their courtship. Within months, the two were wed. And within a year, Randolph was dead. The pattern was nearly identical. Strong man, sudden illness, stomach pains, decline, death. Once again, Ruth was at his side with her tonics, her teas, her soothing hand. Once again, Dr. Harrison arrived too late, his diagnosis reduced to the same tired phrases: bilious fever, nervous strain, tainted food. And once again, Ruth played the role to perfection, the grieving widow, inconsolable, her reputation burnished by suffering. But this time, the whispers grew louder, for among the enslaved who served the Randolph household, there were eyes that saw too much, ears that caught details the gentry ignored. One of them was Caesar, an older man tasked with maintaining the captain's study. After Randolph's death, Caesar discovered a small vial hidden behind a loose board. It contained a fine white powder, faintly bitter, smelling of almonds. When he confided in Jupiter, who now worked for another household, Jupiter's face went pale. "The same thing I saw at Fairfax's," he muttered. "She always has a vial." The slaves began to piece together a narrative the free world refused to see. They noted how Ruth prepared every medicine herself, never allowing others to touch her supplies. They noticed her solitary walks into the woods, returning with baskets of herbs she guarded like treasure. They spoke quietly of her calmness at the very moment her husbands convulsed, as though she had rehearsed their deaths. But society saw only what it wished die, a woman cursed by misfortune, destined for repeated loss. If a widow married twice and lost twice, it was tragic. If she married 3 times and lost 3, it was mysterious. But if she gained wealth and sympathy each time, that was power. By the summer of 1785, Ruth Holloway was untouchable. 2 husbands dead, 2 estates inherited, and yet Richmond society clung to her like moths to a flame. Instead of suspicion, she drew sympathy. Instead of isolation, she drew invitations. The city whispered of her misfortune but praised her dignity. They saw not a pattern but a curse, and Ruth, always graceful, always mournful, allowed them to believe it. It was during this season of whispers that she ensnared her 3rd husband, Judge Thomas Henley, a man of immense influence and sharp ambition. Henley was no mere planter or merchant. He was one of the architects of Virginia's post-revolutionary legal system, a man whose name carried weight in both court and legislature. He was the very definition of untouchable. And yet, Ruth touched him. She touched his pride, his loneliness, his hunger to believe that life still held beauty. Within months, they were married. For a time, all seemed well. Henley flourished, his house alive with political discussion, soirees, and legal debates. Guests marveled at Ruth's ability to glide between conversations of politics and medicine, her charm weaving through the room like smoke. But the smoke was only a veil. The fire burned elsewhere. On a winter's night in January 1786, Judge Henley hosted a dinner party. 12 of Richmond's most prominent citizens gathered in his hall. He was in perfect health, animated, vibrant, speaking of constitutional reform, laughing over brandy. Then, as the evening drew to a close, Ruth approached with a tonic she claimed her late mother had given her father after heavy meals. She poured it with tenderness, pressed it into Henley's hand. He drank without question. Minutes later, in full view of his peers, the judge faltered. His face blanched, his hand clutched his stomach. The laughter drained from the room as he staggered, choking on air, collapsing into convulsions before the horrified eyes of Virginia's elite. Ruth cried out, rushing to his side, her voice cracking in terror. Guests scrambled, summoning Dr. Harrison once more. Yet by the time he arrived, Judge Henley was gone. This time suspicion sharpened. Harrison had seen too much. 3 husbands, 3 sudden deaths, 3 stomach illnesses. He looked at Ruth with new eyes. Yet still, he had no proof. The symptoms could all be explained. The widow's grief, performed with exquisite conviction, silenced every doubt. Who could accuse a woman so composed, so broken, so tragically marked by fate? And yet, in that moment, something shifted. For Ruth had not just killed in private, she had killed in the open. Surrounded by witnesses, she had proven that even the brightest men of the Republic could be made to crumble under her hand. And no one dared speak the truth. That night, as Richmond whispered of tragedy, Ruth lay awake, not weeping, not trembling, but planning. For she had tasted something intoxicating, the thrill of striking boldly in plain sight and watching the world bow to her performance. By the late 1780s, Ruth Holloway's shadow stretched across Richmond like a stain no one dared acknowledge. 3 husbands buried, and yet her name remained untarnished in polite society. If anything, her stature grew. Every tragedy made her seem more delicate, more in need of protection. Invitations to dinners, galas, and political gatherings multiplied. Men still courted her, whispering that she had been cursed by fate. But fate had nothing to do with it. Ruth was sharpening her craft, and the city was too enthralled, or too blind, to see. Her 4th husband was George Carrington, a wealthy plantation owner, who died in 1787 of what physicians called acute dyspepsia. It was the same refrain: stomach pain, a rapid decline, and Ruth at the bedside with her herbal tonics. Her tears flowed convincingly, her posture sagged with grief, and society sighed at her misfortune. Yet Carrington's slaves noticed how Ruth had prepared every dose of his medicine herself, forbidding the cook to enter the room. They noticed the faint odor of bitter almonds. They spoke quietly among themselves, "She is killing them." But their voices lived in whispers, dismissed by a society built on deafness to their truths. A year later, in 1788, came Samuel Bradford, a merchant of considerable means. His nervous fever claimed him in weeks. Again, Ruth inherited. Again, she performed her grief like a seasoned actress. And again, Richmond pitied instead of questioned. By this time, Dr. Harrison, who had now signed 3 death certificates for her husbands, began to feel unease he could not suppress. Yet still he lacked evidence. Each death carried the familiar cloak of plausibility, and Ruth's performance, so precise, so calculated, outshone every doubt. Then, in 1789, banker Edward Custis fell ill. His decline was swifter, his convulsions more violent, his death more undeniable. Harrison stood over the body and told himself that lightning does sometimes strike the same place twice, perhaps even 3 times. But 5 men, all struck by stomach ailments within years of marrying the same widow. His hands trembled as he signed the certificate. Suspicion gnawed at him, but still he remained silent. Ruth's reputation was too immaculate, her influence too broad, her wealth too deeply tied into the veins of Virginia's elite. To accuse her without proof would mean ruin, and Ruth knew it. That was her genius, not only in poison, but in psychology. She understood the machinery of society, its deference to wealth, its blindness to women's cunning, its refusal to hear the voices of the enslaved. She wore these weaknesses like armor. Meanwhile, among the slave quarters, the whispers had hardened into certainty. They kept quiet records. Who had died, how they had died, what Ruth had said, how she had moved. They watched her solitary walks into the forest, returning with baskets of herbs. They spoke of her secret chest, always locked, never touched by another hand. And they began to see what the free world could not. Ruth Holloway was no victim of fate. She was fate itself, an executioner in silks. If Ruth Holloway had relied only on instinct, she might have been caught. But instinct alone does not produce precision. Behind her curtain of lace and grief, she had a teacher, a man who sharpened her methods and expanded her arsenal. His name was Dr. Marcus Wainwright. Once, Wainwright had been respected in Williamsburg, a physician of unusual curiosity. He had studied not only the accepted medical texts of Europe, but also the forbidden manuscripts, alchemical treatises, grimoires on venoms, and the whispered knowledge of slaves who carried African traditions of roots and toxins. It was this curiosity that ruined him. Accused of malpractice after several of his patients died under experimental treatments, he was stripped of his license and banished from polite society. But exile did not erase knowledge, it made him dangerous. Ruth found him in 1786, during her brief widowhood after Judge Henley's death. She had heard of him through the hushed conversations of apothecaries, whispers of a man who knew more about poisons than any physician dared admit. Their meeting was said to have taken place at night, in the back room of a tavern on Shockoe Hill, where Wainwright examined her like a subject under dissection. She confessed her fascination with herbs, her griefs that always seemed to end in death, and her hunger for certainty. He did not flinch. Instead, he offered her a vial of crystalline powder and asked her to test it. Thus began their secret alliance. Wainwright became her tutor, and she his most gifted pupil. He taught her how to disguise bitterness with honey, how to grind seeds into dust finer than flour, how to steep leaves until the line between medicine and death blurred. He spoke of arsenic, mercury, and belladonna, of foxglove and hemlock, of aconite, the queen of poisons. Ruth learned to measure dosages so exact they could stretch suffering for weeks or end a life in minutes. She learned to poison slowly, mimicking fever, or swiftly, striking terror. What bound them together was not romance but intellect, a shared devotion to mastery. Wainwright admired her composure, her ability to cloak murder in performance. She admired his knowledge, his cold detachment, his refusal to bow to moral laws. Together they were surgeon and scalpel. Yet their alliance was fragile. Wainwright was reckless, a man too eager to demonstrate his brilliance, while Ruth was patient, a spider who never rushed her prey. She saw in him both power and liability. Still, for nearly 4 years, their work intertwined. The deaths of Carrington, Bradford, and Custis bore his fingerprints as much as hers. Among the enslaved, their whispers darkened. She is not alone anymore. They spoke of the pale man with hollow eyes who sometimes visited the estate after midnight, carrying satchels of powders and tinctures. They began to call him the poison doctor, but Ruth was not one to share the stage forever. Knowledge she absorbed, alliances she used. And when the time came, Marcus Wainwright would learn the lesson he himself had taught: poisons do not forgive even between friends. By 1790, Ruth Holloway no longer needed Dr. Marcus Wainwright. She had absorbed his knowledge, refined his teachings, and surpassed his carelessness. Where he was flamboyant, she was meticulous. Where he sought notoriety in secret circles, she sought invisibility in plain sight. And that difference, pride versus patience, would decide his fate. Wainwright had grown restless. He wanted recognition, even if only among the hidden apothecaries and whispering physicians who traded in forbidden cures. He spoke too freely of his skills, hinting at his pupil, who could mimic illness with precision. In the smoke-filled corners of taverns, he bragged of a widow who could slay kings without drawing a blade. Word drifted through Richmond like smoke, thin but dangerous. Ruth heard these whispers, and her calm mask never cracked. But inside, she measured the risk. A man like Wainwright, hungry, unstable, arrogant, could undo everything. He was no longer a mentor but a liability. And Ruth did not keep liabilities alive. In late autumn of that year, she invited him to her estate under the pretense of testing a new tincture of foxglove she had prepared. The night was cool, the fire low, the room heavy with the scent of crushed herbs. They worked together as they once had, measuring powders, steeping leaves, like master and apprentice. Wainwright spoke of new opportunities, of traveling north, of selling their knowledge in Philadelphia. He imagined the two of them feared and respected. Ruth listened, her eyes lowered, her voice soft. When she handed him the cup, he drank without hesitation. Perhaps he thought it was one of their experiments. Perhaps he believed himself immune to her designs. Within minutes, his speech faltered. His hands trembled. The arrogance drained from his eyes, replaced by panic. Ruth watched as he collapsed, his body twisting in the grip of aconite, the very poison he had once praised as the queen of assassins. She did not flinch. She did not call for help. She simply sat, watching him struggle until his body stilled. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, she burned his notes, shattered his vials, and erased his presence from her home. By morning, there was no Marcus Wainwright, only ashes and silence. Among the enslaved, however, the disappearance did not go unnoticed. They had seen him arrive, but never leave. They whispered now with certainty Ruth had consumed even her teacher. She was no longer merely a widow who killed her husbands. She was something else, something colder, something untethered from human bond. And yet, in society, her reputation remained unsullied. Wainwright's name carried no honor. Few cared to ask where he had gone. If mentioned at all, he was dismissed as a disgraced quack who had likely fled Virginia to escape debt. But Ruth knew the truth. She had severed the last tie that might bind her. She was no longer the pupil. She was the master. With Wainwright gone, Ruth Holloway entered a new stage of her reign. The deaths of husbands had given her wealth and sympathy, but now she hungered for something sharper. Control. Widowhood could only shield her so long. Whispers of misfortune could only be repeated so many times before doubt crept into even the most polite drawing rooms. To secure her place, Ruth began turning her poisons outward, not just against those bound to her by marriage, but against rivals and enemies who threatened her standing in Richmond's fragile hierarchy. Her first target was Martha Price, a sharp-tongued matron who had whispered too openly that Ruth was too unlucky to be trusted. At a tea gathering in 1791, Ruth prepared the refreshments herself, a rare gesture that charmed the other ladies. Martha Price sipped her cup, praised its sweetness, and within the week was bedridden with violent cramps. She lingered in agony for 10 days before dying, her condition blamed on spoiled preserves. The other women in society clucked in sympathy, but Ruth noticed how their eyes avoided hers afterward. They feared her, even if they could not name why. Next came Daniel Withers, a banker who had attempted to block her inheritance from Edward Custis, claiming irregularities in the will. His sudden collapse during a meeting, clutching his stomach, silenced any legal disputes. By the time his associates buried him, Ruth's claim was untouchable. What was striking was not merely the deaths themselves, but Ruth's artistry. She varied her methods, slow poisons that mimicked consumption, quick ones that struck like apoplexy, and even herbal concoctions that left the appearance of natural aging. Each death left just enough ambiguity for physicians to write their diagnosis without suspicion, though, privately, Dr. Harrison had begun to see a pattern that chilled him. Among the enslaved, there was no ambiguity. They watched her pattern stretch from the household into the city itself. They whispered that she carried death in her hands. Wherever she went, they noticed how no rival ever stood against her for long, how every voice that questioned her somehow fell silent. Their whispers grew into a quiet chronicle, a hidden record of her victims, carried in stories passed from kitchen to quarters. By the mid-1790s, Ruth Holloway was no longer merely a widow of misfortune. She was a woman with a reputation that hovered between reverence and dread. In the parlors of Richmond, she was invited out of pity. In the streets, she was avoided out of fear, and in the hidden corners of the city, among the enslaved who could not speak their truth aloud, she had earned a darker title, the Widow of Richmond. By 1795, the veil Ruth Holloway had woven so carefully began to fray. For nearly 2 decades she had buried husbands, silenced rivals, and maneuvered herself into a position of wealth and untouchable influence. Yet even the most artful predator leaves traces, and those traces began to converge in dangerous ways. Dr. William Harrison, the physician who had signed more of her death certificates than any other man alive, could no longer quiet his conscience. 5 husbands, 2 rivals, a banker, and now whispers of others, neighbors, acquaintances, servants, who had wasted away after crossing paths with the Widow of Richmond. Each case, standing alone, was plausible, but together the pattern screamed. Harrison began to keep a private ledger of her deaths, careful not to show it to anyone. His fear was not only of Ruth's wrath, but of society itself. To accuse a woman of her stature without proof would be to court ruin, perhaps even charges of slander. At the same time, the enslaved community's whispers had grown into something more deliberate. Within the quarters, stories of Ruth were told with terrifying consistency, how she slipped powders into tea, how she masked bitterness with honey, how men staggered after only days in her care. They had watched Waywright arrive and never leave. They had seen the pattern of her midnight herb gathering walks. Unlike the free citizens of Richmond, they were not blinded by wealth or manners. To them she was not unlucky. She was deliberate, a quiet executioner cloaked in silk. These 2 currents, Harrison's unease and the enslaved people's certainty, were still far apart. One was locked away in the careful ink of a physician's private notebook, the other passed mouth to ear in hushed tones over cooking fires. But history has a way of drawing such strands together, and Ruth, sharp as she was, had begun to sense it. Her paranoia deepened. She watched Harrison's eyes whenever he examined a body. She grew sharper with her slaves, punishing even small mistakes with cold fury. She tested her food constantly, convinced that someone might attempt to poison her in return. The predator had begun to feel hunted, and yet her greatest weapon remained what it had always been: society's blindness. The gentlemen of Richmond still pitied her, still believed her, cursed by fate. The women still invited her to teas and socials, even if their hands trembled slightly when passing her a cup. The machinery of class and gender still worked in her favor, wrapping her in a shield stronger than steel. But cracks were forming. Harrison's ledger was growing. The enslaved record was spreading, and soon, inevitably, someone would try to bridge the two. The Widow of Richmond's legend was on the edge of becoming her downfall. The first public ripple of suspicion came not from a man of medicine, nor from the enslaved whispers, but from a young lawyer named Thomas Redfield. Redfield was newly returned from Philadelphia, eager to prove himself in Richmond's courts. He had heard the name Holloway, murmured in both awe and unease. Unlike the older men of society, who still clung to the fiction of her old lucky life, Redfield was unburdened by nostalgia. He saw patterns quickly, without sentiment. Too many husbands dead, too many rivals silenced, too much wealth gathered by one woman under the cloak of tragedy. In 1796, after the sudden illness of a plantation owner who had quarreled with Ruth over a boundary line, Redfield muttered in a tavern, "It is not misfortune that follows that woman. It is something else." His words spread faster than he imagined. By morning, Richmond society buzzed, not with accusation, but with that exquisite thrill of scandal. Some laughed it off, others whispered behind closed doors, but the idea had been planted. Perhaps Ruth Holloway was not cursed, but dangerous. Ruth felt it immediately. Invitations grew fewer. Conversations at gatherings stiffened. Where once she was met with pity, she now saw wariness, even calculation, in the eyes of her neighbors. And though no one dared accuse her openly, the shift in tone was unmistakable. She responded as she always had, with performance. Ruth doubled her piety, attending church services with saintly devotion. She increased her acts of charity, donating to widows, orphanages, and the poor. She visited the sick, bringing broth and prayers, her hands folded with seeming humility. In doing so, she reminded Richmond of its favorite illusion that women were caretakers, not killers, that a widow's tears were pure, not poisoned, and it worked, at least for a time. Redfield found himself ridiculed by older attorneys, warned to mind his tongue. unless he wanted to be ruined for slander. The society Ruth had manipulated for decades turned on him instead of her, preserving her carefully woven mask. But beneath the silken smiles, Ruth was unsettled. For the first time, suspicion had surfaced in public. She had seen how quickly a single phrase, a single careless whisper could turn. And though she had buried many threats before, she knew ideas were harder to kill than men. Meanwhile, Dr. Harrison's ledger continued to grow, and the enslaved who watched both Ruth and the gossiping whites began to wonder how long it would be before truth and suspicion finally touched. The air around Ruth Holloway was no longer silence. It was tension, thin, stretched, ready to tear. If Ruth Holloway felt the walls tightening, she did not retreat, she struck harder. For decades her poisons had been measured, precise, calculated for individuals. But by the late 1790s, suspicion required a new kind of ruthlessness. She would no longer pluck threats one by one. She would scorch entire branches of them before they had time to grow. Her first move was against Thomas Redfield, the young lawyer whose careless words had nearly cracked her mask. Killing him outright would have been too obvious, too validating of his suspicions. Instead, Ruth played the long game. She sent him subtle gifts, jars of preserved fruit, bottles of cordial, loaves of sugared bread, tokens of forgiveness, from a grieving widow eager to mend her reputation. Within months, Redfield was coughing blood, his energy wasting. The physicians called it a wasting fever. Ruth called it justice. When he died, his warnings about her were remembered only as the ramblings of a bitter, sickly youth who had sought to make his name through scandal. But Ruth did not stop with Redfield. She turned her gaze on the enslaved network, sensing a storm she could not quite see. Their whispers had not reached white ears yet, but she understood the danger of memory carried in secret tongues. So she began dismantling it. Those who spoke too freely were sold off to distant counties. Families were broken, their oral records scattered. One young house servant, rumored to have seen her grind herbs late at night, disappeared without trace. Some said she was sent to the Carolinas, others that she never left the Holloway estate at all. Ruth's cruelty deepened in these years. Where once she had reserved her poisons for those in her way, now she used fear itself as a weapon. Slaves were forced to taste her dishes before they reached her lips. An act framed as caution, but one that sent a chilling message. She alone controlled the boundary between life and death in her household. Even among the enslaved, whose suffering was constant, Ruth Holloway's shadow grew monstrous. Yet her escalation carried risks. The more people vanished, the more talk stirred, even if only in quiet corners. Dr. Harrison noted the sudden sales, the abrupt illnesses, the way suspicion clung to her like smoke. His ledger grew darker, each entry edged with dread. He knew if anyone could bring her down, it would not be a courtroom nor the gossiping elites, but the weight of accumulated whispers, white and black alike, colliding into truth. Still, for now, Ruth reigned. The lawyer silenced, the enslaved broken, her wealth secure. She had transformed from a widow of misfortune into something more deliberate. An architect of fear, a woman who reshaped Richmond's social order with poison and terror. But her triumph was fragile. For every rival she silenced, a new trace remained. Every misfortune she orchestrated tightened the circle of eyes around her. And Ruth Holloway knew, perhaps better than anyone, that poisons do not vanish, they linger, they accumulate, and sooner or later, they leave a stain that cannot be erased. By 1798, Dr. William Harrison could no longer bear the weight of silence. His ledger, hidden beneath loose floorboards in his study, had grown thick with names, dates, and causes of death. Each entry seemed innocent when read alone, but together they formed a grim ledger of one woman's quiet war against the people of Richmond. Harrison was not a bold man by nature. He was cautious, deliberate, the kind of physician who measured twice before prescribing once. But each time he pressed his pen to the page, recording another fever or apoplexy under Ruth Holloway's roof, he felt less like a doctor and more like her accomplice. The very act of signing death certificates in her favor made his stomach twist. Still, he knew the danger of speaking openly. Ruth Holloway was not merely a widow, she was an institution. Wealth, property, and decades of social standing shielded her from suspicion. To accuse her without absolute proof was to invite ruin, or worse. And yet, Harrison could not shake the feeling that if he remained silent, history would brand him a coward who let a serpent coil unchallenged in the heart of Richmond. It was not among the gentlemen of the city that Harrison sought allies, but in quieter corners. He began listening to the enslaved. At first, he caught fragments whispers that Ruth's hands were never clean, that she ground herbs by moonlight, that no master who crossed her ever lived long. At a sick call to a neighboring household, he overheard two women in the quarters speak her name with dread. When they realized he was listening, they fell silent. But he had heard enough to know his suspicions were shared, even if the voices carrying them were those society refused to hear. Harrison began to test the waters. In guarded conversations with a fellow physician, he hinted at a troubling pattern among certain deaths. The man paled, shook his head, and warned Harrison to leave such matters alone. "You'll find yourself poisoned, too." That chilling rebuke only deepened Harrison's resolve. He started copying his ledger into a second book, one he kept hidden beneath the false bottom of his medical chest. If anything happened to him, he intended for the truth to outlive him. He had not yet decided how, or when, to use it. Meanwhile, Ruth seemed to sense the shift in the air. Her eyes lingered on Harrison longer during consultations, as though weighing whether he, too, had become a threat. Each visit left him rattled, certain that the Widow of Richmond was reading his very thoughts. For now, Harrison still lived. But he was no longer merely her physician. He was becoming her historian, and, perhaps, the architect of her eventual undoing. Ruth Holloway had always known how to read people, but with Dr. Harrison she grew especially watchful. His eyes lingered too long on the bodies she presented. His questions cut too close to the marrow. He signed her death certificates, yes, but not with the careless flourish of a man at ease. His hand trembled now. His gaze darted. She could feel it. Harrison was carrying something in silence, so she tested him. At her next gathering, a modest supper for a handful of neighbors, Ruth seated Harrison at her right hand, pouring his wine herself. She leaned close, asking if he had heard the ghastly rumor that some foolish young lawyer once accused her of wickedness. She laughed lightly, as though the thought were absurd, but her eyes never left his. Harrison forced a smile, murmuring that people would say anything in grief. Yet the sweat at his temple betrayed him. Later that evening, she pressed further. One of her guests, a merchant's wife, pale from illness, collapsed in a faint. Harrison rushed to her side, checking her pulse, prescribing calm. Ruth watched the scene with a predator's patience. When the woman was revived, Ruth whispered to Harrison, "You must tire of death following me like a shadow. Tell me, doctor, do you ever wonder if it is me fate pursues, or I who invite it?" The question was framed as a jest, but Harrison felt the venom under its sugar. He stammered out a polite denial. Ruth smiled, but in her mind, the test was complete. Harrison was hiding something. From that night forward, she tightened her circle around him. She invited him more often, showering him with tokens of gratitude, baskets of fruit, bottles of cordial, spiced cakes, always with a watchful eye, always with the quiet question, will he consume what I give or hesitate? Harrison, aware of the danger, learned to nibble just enough to convince her, slipping the rest into his satchel to dispose of later. Every visit became a duel masked as courtesy. At the same time, Ruth spread subtle whispers about Harrison. To society's matrons, she hinted at his frail nerves and morbid fascinations with death. To gentlemen, she suggested he was touch melancholic and prone to flights of fancy. By the time her words circulated, Harrison's credibility was already being eroded. If ever he turned on her, the soil of Richmond would be primed to dismiss him as unstable. Yet Harrison persisted. Each encounter with Ruth deepened his conviction that she knew of his suspicions and was waiting for him to stumble. He returned home each night shaken, scribbling fresh notes into his secret ledger with a trembling hand. The dance between them had shifted. No longer physician and patient, widow and confidant, they had become predator and prey. But which was no longer clear. By the spring of 1799, Dr. William Harrison understood that he could not carry the burden alone. His ledger was damning, yes, but it was still only paper. Without allies, it would die with him, whether by age, accident, or Ruth Holloway's careful hand. The question was no longer if he would act, but how. The clergy seemed the safest place to start. Richmond's ministers were men of stature, untouchable in their piety, their words carrying weight in both pulpit and parlor. If Ruth could be unmasked, surely it would be through God's mouthpieces. Harrison first approached Reverend James Pendleton, an aging rector whose sermons carried thunder, but whose body was failing. In the quiet of the vestry, Harrison hinted at his fears that a woman in their midst bore responsibility for pattern of untimely deaths. Pendleton listened, grave but cautious, and finally sighed, "Doctor, the devil walks in every heart. But if you name the wrong one, you risk damnation in this life before the next." He urged silence, not action. Disappointed, Harrison tried another route: the law. Not through hot-blooded young lawyers like Thomas Redfield, who had already been destroyed, but through a magistrate, Samuel Wilkes, a careful man with a reputation for fairness. Over ale in a tavern's back room, Harrison raised the idea of suspicious misfortunes, tied to a prominent widow. Wilkes frowned, his hand tightening on his mug. "You speak of Holloway," he said flatly. Harrison froze, then nodded. Wilkes leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You are not the first to whisper such things. But tell me, have you proof?" Proof. The word cut like a blade. Harrison thought of his ledger, of the enslaved whispers, of the jars of cordial he dared not drink. Yet proof, in the eyes of Richmond's courts, meant something far heavier than suspicion. It meant catching Ruth with poison in her hand, or a witness brave enough to swear against her. Neither seemed within reach. When he admitted as much, Wilkes shook his head. "Then you have nothing, and without nothing you risk everything." Still, Wilkes did not dismiss him outright. "Keep your eyes open," the magistrate said before leaving. "If you live long enough to see more, perhaps the law will be ready." It was a half-promise, a seed planted, but not yet hope. Meanwhile, Ruth's shadow loomed larger. Her charity grew louder, her presence more saintly. The louder the whispers of suspicion, the more public her displays of piety became. Each loaf she gave to the poor, each coin pressed into a beggar's palm, was another stone laid against Harrison's quiet warnings. He returned home that night, weary, realizing that in trying to move against her, he had also revealed himself. If Wilkes knew of his suspicions, it was only a matter of time before Ruth knew as well. The ledger beneath his floorboards had become not just his weapon, but his only shield, and in Richmond's dimly lit parlors, the widow Holloway was beginning to ask her own questions: who, exactly, was keeping account of her? Ruth Holloway had always trusted her instincts, and they rarely failed her. Something in Dr. Harrison's manner had changed. An extra pause before speaking, a restless shifting of his eyes, the faintest tremor in his hand when she pressed him with questions. He was no longer simply her physician. He was hiding something, and Ruth did not allow secrets to remain out of her grasp. She began to probe. Through her servants, she inquired after Harrison's habits: what time he left his practice, whom he met, how long he lingered in taverns before returning home. She pressed the enslaved in her household, too, under the guise of idle curiosity, asking whether they had heard the doctor mention her name, or seen him linger too long over his papers. A few shook their heads quickly, fearful of even breathing the wrong answer. Others gave vague mutterings about Harrison being a man who writes too much. That phrase alone sharpened her suspicions. One evening, she invited Harrison again, this time under the pretense of thanking him for his tireless devotion. She led him into her study, an intimate space filled with books, portraits, and a faint scent of pressed lavender. There, she spoke of mortality, of the strange burden borne by those who witnessed so much death. Her voice was honey, but her eyes were searching. "You must keep records," she said softly, pouring him a glass of cordial. "A man like you, so precise. Tell me, doctor, what is it you write when the world sleeps?" Harrison froze. Just for a breath, but it was enough. He recovered quickly, murmuring something about medical notes and routine observations. Ruth smiled at his reply, yet her mind was already turning. If Harrison did keep notes, then somewhere lay a written account of her life and her deaths. That night, after he left, Ruth set another plan in motion. She sent one of her most trusted servants, a wary young man named Josiah, to shadow Harrison discreetly. Josiah was clever, silent-footed, and utterly loyal to her, for she owned his freedom papers, though she had never granted them. Within a week, Josiah returned with news Harrison was indeed writing at night, his lamp burning long past midnight. On several occasions, he had hidden papers when footsteps approached. Ruth's suspicions hardened into certainty. The ledger existed, and if it existed, it had to be destroyed. But she would not rush. A single misstep might confirm to Harrison that she was aware of his secret. Instead, she chose patience, weaving her net more tightly. She cultivated warmth toward him, masking her watchfulness behind gratitude and charm. She whispered to her servants to note every time Harrison left his home unattended. She even considered sending him a small gift, a box of imported tobacco, perhaps, or sugared almonds, something tempting enough that she might slip in a test of her own. For Ruth Holloway, the game had shifted. Until now she had been content to silence men one by one. But Harrison was not like the others. He was not merely another victim to be dispatched. He was a chronicler, a threat to her story itself, and that made him the most dangerous man she had ever faced.